go through 12c, 18c, 19c, and version 21c in terms of different changes that have come across and everything like that. So with that being said, Oracle is actually a relational database management system. What makes it kind of unique to me in regards to the other database management systems we talked about is Oracle was the only one that I had known of or heard of, or at least the company I had heard of before coming into Messiah and learning about databases, which kind of makes it unique to me. Some popular companies that use Oracle are eBay, Netflix, and LinkedIn, which are all big companies that you guys have probably heard about or used in the past. There's a couple different things that differentiate Oracle from other database management systems, including the high availability of data, which means that happens at all times. So even if there are periods of failure or inactivity, you'll always be able to access data with the Oracle. The performance and scalability of Oracle databases are second to none, according to the internet. And Oracle offers mechanisms to monitor and control access to the database, which is kind of unique in some of the other features and assistance tools that they have in line with their software. So first thing we're going to talk about is installing Oracle. The installation process is pretty straightforward and generally goes through a wizard if you're on Windows versus goes through the command line interface when you're on any Linux systems. The installation covers a broad range of hardware, software, different network resource requirements, and to launch different settings or just launch the app in general. While these haven't changed drastically over the release, there are a few different notable changes that we'll talk through. And so I'm going to kind of highlight the key differences throughout the releases. Starting with the release talked about in the book, which was the University installer. This is kind of the GUI that you go through, or the wizard, which would help you install Oracle database. There's also the silent installer, which is the command line that we talked about for different Linux operating systems or Unix. There have different system requirements, including hardware, software, and network resources. So at the time of this release in the book, you needed at least 2 cores of memory, 512 megabytes of RAM, and only 1 gig of hard disk space in order to install on your computer. It was supported by Windows, Linux, Unix, and Solaris. And there was also a multi-tenancy release. And that would kind of move us towards release 18C, where they released something called pre-installation tasks, which were operating system parameters and different network settings that you needed along with the system requirements. This included anything from bandwidth or stuff like that, that they could just kind of make sure that you have the power to not only host the database, but use it as well. They added configuration options which offered less disk space and memory when you were going throughout the installation process to make it easier and more efficient on your computer. They made multi-tenancy a default option, added the Oracle Data Safe feature, and as well as added the autonomous database deployment option and released the update feature. So in Oracle 19c, there was a data reduction security feature, which helped with security during the installation process. I wasn't able to go into too much detail about what that is, but at a low level, it just made the installation process and downloading files and stuff like that a little bit more secure. And there was also some performance improvements with installation, making it again faster and more efficient. And finally, in 21C, the main difference through the years was the minimum system requirement would increase. You still needed at least 2 cores, and you still needed 512 megabytes of RAM. However, the biggest change was they went from needing 2 gigabytes to 10 gigabytes of hard drive space. With that being said, I'm going to invite Justin up to talk about privileges.
All right, so privileges in Oracle. The basis idea of them is pretty similar throughout all the different versions. So essentially just privileges they give users in Oracle the ability to perform specific kinds of actions or operations. There are 2 main types in this, system and object. So object kind of allows users to perform actions on database objects, so like things like tables, views, so on and so forth. That's going to include commands like select, insert, delete. And then there's system privileges, which allows users to perform more like administrative tasks. So that's going to be things more like creating and dropping tables, and maybe giving privileges to users. So that'll feature things like create database and create session. In addition to this, when you're granting privileges, there are two general ways to grant privileges to users in Oracle, and that is the kind of like standard SQL way with grant. And Oracle also has its own little enterprise manager where people who have administrative privileges can kind of like go in, select users, and then assign tasks to that users throughout a menu. So it's basically just a GUI interface to assign privileges. So moving on as to what the key differences or changes were. So there are some pretty interesting changes between these ones. So if we're looking at 12c, some interesting things that happened with this is, so they implemented a new privilege model for the multi-tenant architecture system, which was a pretty interesting little feature. They also included new system privileges for their pluggable databases, as well as enhanced support for unified auditing, which kind of helped their security a little bit. And when we move on to 18c, we can see that they introduced a new system privilege for JSON-related operations, as well as they improved the ability to manage privilege escalation, so that that kind of helped monitor some of those security aspects. And then once they got to 19c, they had decided to introduce some new system privileges. They introduced more for the JSON operations because there were a couple of security flaws, if I remember correctly. And they also improved the ability to manage. Why is that copied? That's my mistake. In the slide notes, there should be the correct information on that. That's my bad. Moving on to 21c, they had advanced threat protection. They did a lot in this one. They did advanced threat protection, data redaction. They moved to improve password management. They just added a bunch of privileges for passwords, for users to create and grant passwords to modify kind of like, minimum password length, complexity, things along that nature. They also introduced new system privileges for managing data privacy and security. In addition to that, they improved the ability to manage privilege escalation once again, because that is continuously an issue with privileges, because the main concern with privileges, as we'll talk about in the next slide, is if you give the privilege to a wrong person, or if someone abuses that privilege, it generally results in privilege escalation of them giving too many privileges to someone else, or them abusing their own privilege. So there are some newly added privileges within these releases. So 12c release 1, they put in create pluggable database. So this system allowed the user to create a pluggable database in the multi-tenant environment, which Ryan went over earlier. They added the audit admin, which is a privilege that enables a user to perform audit administration tasks, such as managing audit policies and viewing audit logs. They also added restricted session. This is a privilege that allowed a user to enable or disable a restricted session. User to enable or disable a restricted session. There are many others, however, I'm not going to bore you with the numerous, so I'm only going to give you 3 for each. Moving on to 18c, there was execute any program, which, as you can imagine, simply gives a user the ability to execute any program within it. JSON, this is more of a set of privileges that allows a user to do a number of tasks that refer to JSON documents. DBA user, as you can imagine, it's just a privilege that provides a user with a number of privileges that include a number of database administrative tasks. Onto 19c, we have restricted session PDB. Now, what this was used for is this allowed a user to enable and disable restricted sessions within the pluggable database. This is just an updated, so it's strange. So restricted session, which we talked about in 12c release 1, wasn't as applicable with pluggable databases. This one, however, is strange. There's 2 restricted sessions from what it looked like on their documentation. And moving on to Datapump XP full database and Datapump INP full database. These privileges allowed users to perform full database export and import operations. And then we have exempt redaction policy, which allowed a user to bypass a redaction policy and view the original data. Moving on to 21C, we have privacy. This simply enables the user to manage data privacy and security rules on the system. And then we have managed scheduler, which is a system privilege that provides a user with a number of privileges to manage database scheduling, which includes like modifying and creating jobs. And then we have password grace time. So this is one of the privileges that was included in 21C along with many other password privileges. So this system privilege enables a user to modify the grace period for password expiration dates. Now we can move on to a bit more of the security concerns. So again, with privileges, the biggest one is going to be privilege escalation. And that is pretty much applicable to all of these, so I really only included it in the first one, just to kind of put it in there. Now, next up we have multi-tenancy. So with the introduction of this, there were a number of concerns. So if like a user would use a create session in one pluggable database, they could actually expand that privilege to connect to other pluggable databases, so they could kind of spread their hold within the system. So you have to kind of be really careful with that. And in the book, it also mentions the public privilege, which it's a strange thing. So it's kind of like an umbrella privilege. So you add privileges to the public privilege, and whatever's in that public privilege, everyone has. So this one had to be used with caution, because if you gave the public privilege too much power, you'd have, again, problem with privilege escalation. You'd be giving potentially some people too much privilege. If you had a guest user on it, they would have access to this. So you'd want to be really, really careful and really reserved with that privilege. So misuse of that could result in a number of vulnerabilities. Moving on to 18C, we have role-based access control. Now, what happened with this was when they introduced this into 18C, it improved manageability. However, again, with privilege escalation, if a role was given too much power and you just kind of haphazardly assign that role to someone else in kind of a hurry and just thinking that that's what they would need, and too many privileges were included in that role, you'd be giving a user too much power, or potentially not enough if the role isn't sufficient enough. Then we have redaction security. Now the problem with this was it allowed sensitive data to be masked or obscured to certain users. However, there were some security concerns related to misconfigured roles. So again, it pertains to roles and just misconfiguring them. Most of these concerns is just people not managing it correctly. So if you didn't give roles the correct redaction security, you could have people who are only allowed to see things in like the sales database, looking into, I don't know, company health records or whatever it is. So you'd have to be really, really careful with redaction security. And then we have multi-tenancy security again for 19C. This one, so they introduced the application root concept in 19C, and this caused a user who's very privileged in one pluggable database, they could once again use it to access sensitive information within another pluggable database. So they kind of fixed that problem, and then they brought it back by accident. Then we can move on to, data privacy. This is fairly similar to redaction security, where they introduced a number of new system privileges, so they kind of just made it difficult for managers to kind of get back into control, and they had to relearn these new privacy roles or privileges. So they kind of had to be careful with assigning those specific roles or specific people. Moving on to 21C, there was some advanced threat protection. This was a new security feature which would improve the overall security of the database. However, there were still a number of just general vulnerabilities within this, so it wasn't necessarily flaw-proof. One example was if a user was granted unnecessary privileges, it could be used to. Again, it was very similar to multi-tenancy, where there were some privileges that allowed users to reach into other databases that they weren't allowed to. So that was one kind of bypass, and so they could assign themselves what seemed like lower privileges that wouldn't be a concern, but it still got them access to other databases. And then, of course, there's basic password management, which again kind of applies to most of these. However, with the new implementation of a number of password privileges for password managers, if these are misconfigured, it gave password managers way more power, and so if they were misconfigured or misused, it would result in a weaker security. And next we can move on to user roles by 8.
Thanks, Justin. All right. Keep this short and simple. Talk about user roles in Oracle. I imagine most of you know what a user role is. It's a way you can group users together and assign them privileges as a whole group rather than individual people. This makes managing permissions very easy, and you can also add and remove users to a team without having to worry about managing the permissions separately. In a previous version, roles were not enabled by default in 12C Release 1, so they had to be enabled manually using the alter database statement. In 18C, a new system-defined role called Audit Admin was added. It allows users to manage auditing policies and audit records. 19C, changes were made to password management for the roles with the introduction of the password lifetime parameter. It specified the number of days that a password can be used for a role before it expires. And finally, 21C introduced hierarchical roles. These roles, you could grant roles, kind of like roles within roles, creating a parent-child relationship. This makes it easier to manage large sets of privileges, as well as provides granular control over privileges. So the security concerns by adding these, immediately you can mismanage them, just pure setup error, human error. Assigning too many privileges to one role or not revoking another from a role is no longer needed and can increase the risk of unauthorized access to sensitive data. In addition to that, privilege escalation. If a user is assigned to a role with higher privileges than necessary, they may be able to access data that they should not have access to. Third, the role hierarchy. The introduction of hierarchical roles in 21C can create security concerns if not properly managed. Improper management of these hierarchical roles can result in granting unnecessary privileged access. Finally, audit policies. In version 18C, the audit admin role was introduced, which allows users to manage auditing policies and audit records. However, if the role is not properly managed, it can increase the risk of audit tampering and unauthorized access.
Alright, so I'm going to be talking about password policies, and I'm sure most of you know what they are by now, but if you need a little bit of a refresher, they're basically just a set of rules designed to enhance computer security by encouraging users to employ strong passwords and use them properly, and are often just a part of an organization's official regulations, and they establish a standard for creating passwords. So with Oracle, in the 12C Release 1, the passwords are encrypted in the DBA user table. They cannot include simple words, server names, account usernames, server names with numbers added, or account usernames with numbers added. They have to be between 8 and 30 characters and can be as long as 128 characters. A new password must differ from previously used passwords by at least 3 letters, and 1 digit and 1 alphabetic character must be used within a password, and it cannot begin with a number Also, it can begin with a underscore money symbol or hashtag, and the passwords beginning with a special character or containing any character other than the underscore money symbol or hashtag must be surrounded by quotation marks. So the defaults for the passwords are that after 10 failed login attempts are allowed before the account is locked. The password is valid for 180 days, and there's an unlimited number of days that must pass before a password can be reused. Also, there's an unlimited number of times a password can be reused. And then an account is locked due to failed attempts for 1 day, and then the number of days ahead of expiration that the user is warned is 7. Looking at 18C, some of the changes are that passwords can now be a maximum of 30 bytes long, and they also now started to use AES encryption. And within the defaults, there are some changes, and just that inactive account time was set to unlimited as the default. And then within 19C, it just removed database supplied schemas passwords to prevent users from authenticating to these accounts. And then in Oracle 21C, there is new user profile and update user profile to comply with STIG and CIS standards for password management. And the application can change its database passwords without an administrator having to schedule downtime, and then also all the passwords in the new password files are case sensitive.
So we're going to be talking about auditing. And auditing, what is it? So the the Oracle auditing database basically captures detailed information from who, what, when, and how the action was performed. And through the process of auditing, it collects a record of the activities and what system was recording the who, what, when, and how. So how do you build an Oracle audit? So you build an Oracle audit through their predefined list and their audit policy. When you enter the database, they do have a unified audit, which comes with a predefined list of like user privileges, monitoring, and a lot of stuff. So you don't really have to do too much with it. But you can also create and customize your own audit by adjusting the setting when you're in the database to monitor certain activities and things you want to pay attention to. The auditing process is done by just collecting information again on security events that are happening within your database, and it also stores sensitive data from your user and the logons. So auditing is the most effective way to protect your database. It tracks the privileges, again, the activities that your highly privileged users use, the sensitive data that are stored in there, and modifications can be done to it. So that's why a lot of companies flock to the Oracle audit. So what is a database auditing typically used for or used to do? So it's used to monitor activities of privileged database administrators. It detects unauthorized activities on sensitive asset, assist with investigation of data breaches or other suspicious activities. It also is used to provide proof of like monitoring critical asset to your auditors, and it's also used to provide a report on changes to the database environment. And a lot of the time your reports are stemming from your unified audit. So the different versions, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just wanted to point out that, and I did version 12 all the way to 21, and in 12, the Oracle database was using traditional auditing, which stopped being used in version 21C. After 12C, all the other versions started using a unified auditing trail, and this one is just by Oracle came up with a list of things that they want to pay attention to and focus on, and that's very secure for a company. So with their regulated unified list, that's the new standard. So they took away the traditional auditing where you have to go, you're trying to like figure out what you need, and they just have a standard that kind of like boxes everything else. So how to maintain an effective auditing planning technique. So the first thing to do to have an effective auditing planning technique is to make sure you're following the regulatory compliance needs, what the standard is around for your company and also for the database you're using. Adapting to your organization's risk tolerance and what you frequently use and the quantity of data you want to maintain or discard. The third is timely detecting the threat, so you don't want to have a threat within your system and you're not aware of it, so you want to always be on top of what's going on and what's coming in and out of your system. The fourth is keeping your audit within acceptable performance overhead limit. So there is a limit to how much data you can have and maintaining that so that you're not keeping things you don't need and you're staying relevant and on top so you can be able to detect threats. The fifth one is managing your results and your data volume. Again, that plays into point 4 and 3. This is all for better detection and threat protection. And the last one is controlling storage costs required to house your collected audit data. So the auditing trails are very big and they can be very expensive, so you just have to always maintain a standard and also just the amount that you need as a company or as an organization, because overfilling your database with too much trails can lead to low performances and just slow detection within intruders. So database auditing is a very important organizational data security thing, and it enables your organization to better monitor and detect any suspicious activities, and it also helps you stay on top of the compliances and the regulation for having a secure organization. Effective auditing requires that your audit process policies be selective and focused, and that ensures that your records are generated for what you need and to best maintain your organization.
All right, authentication. So authentication is the act of proving an assertion, such as the identity of a computer system user. And specifically in this case, this would be proving you are who you say you are, that you have the required privileges to be there. Usually through some form of biometrics, one-time code type of deal that only really the correct user should have. This is very important because you have to verify who the user is, who they say they are, and therefore that they have the necessary authorization to do what they're trying to do. This helps ensure unauthorized parties don't gain access to a system and wreak havoc. So in version 12C, they introduced Advanced Security, which was a comprehensive security application to enhance authentication. They also had database linking, which allows access to data from remote servers without additional credentials. And the two authentication methods they supported between database links were current user and connect to user. In 18C, they introduced rapid home provisioning, which allows authentication between servers. Login credentials could be provided or authentication could be automatically handled. They had a new plugin framework, which supported user-defined authentication procedures. And a user can't log into the database schema unless the account is modified to accept an authentication method. In 19C, they had social sign-in, which supports authentication with Google, Facebook, other social networks. So kind of those buttons you click that just quickly authenticate for you. And they used OpenID Connect or OAuth 2 standards for that. And then in 21C, when you configure Kerberos authentication for an Oracle database client, you can specify multiple Kerberos principals with a single Oracle database client. And they also made it so that setting no NTML made the database and the client more secure. They added default to true. Default user accounts. These are the accounts created by default, obviously, with every Oracle system install. And they have specific privileges and serve specific purposes. The number and type of default accounts created during the install can vary depending on what options you choose and features. There are three main types of accounts that can be created: administrative, non-administrative, and sample users. Most accounts are created to expire and be locked after installation. This is very important because like the passwords for these you could like just look up and find, so either you have to make sure that they get deleted after you use them, or that you change the password if you need to continue to use them. So in 12C, there are three accounts created during install and for use automatically: sys, sysman, and system. The sys account is similar to the SA account in SQL Server, and it allows administrative tasks within the database. Sysman account allows database administration, specifically for Oracle Enterprise Manager, and the system is the default generic database administrator account. Sys and system are automatically granted the DBA role, but system is the only account that should be used to create additional tables and views. And the default passwords are created for these three accounts. They're generic and should be changed immediately, as I talked about previously. At 18C, they have the DBSN MP. This is used by the Oracle Intelligent Agent to monitor and manage the database. The OutLN, this is an account used by the Oracle Optimizer to store outlines for SQL statements and to improve query performance. SysBackup, obviously for creating database backups and recovery operations. SysDG is the account used for Oracle Data Guard operations. And SysKM is used for Oracle key management operations and to manage database encryption keys. Nothing of note in 19C that was added, and then in 21C, they added the AUD-SYS, which is created to manage database auditing. Has the necessary privileges to capture and store audit information. It's recommended that you disable or delete this account if auditing is not required. And then the GSM admin internal is created for managing Oracle Global Database data services, which enable you to manage multiple Oracle databases as a single unified system. And the account has the necessary privileges to manage that. Reserved words. These are words that have special meaning to Oracle and can't be redefined. You can't use these as unquoted identifiers to name database objects, such as columns, tables, or indexes. You may use some of them as quoted identifiers, but it's not recommended. This is the extensive list. Obviously, I'm not going to read all of them, but the main point, is that if you're working with a database, you should be aware that these exist and kind of have an idea of what they are. Kind of helps you save time down the road if you try to use them and it's like, oh, you can't use that, and just making sure you're using them properly in the right context.
All right, architecture. Architecture is the whole thing that brings this all together, backbone of the entire Oracle database stuff. So you have, the Oracle database is really broken down into two main sections. You have the instance and the actual database itself. You guys know what the database is. I won't explain that. That's just generally what things are. The instance is what you use to interact with the database in an Oracle database structure. So within that, you can kind of break it up into three more categories: the memory, physical database structure, and the different processes. With the memory, you basically have the memory that acts within the instance and the memory that acts outside of the instance and can act throughout all of the databases outside of just the instance that you're using to interact with the databases. The database physical structure, it's basically the main files you have for the database. There's three main files that you should really be familiar with when you're dealing with the Oracle structure: the control file, the redo file, and the data files. Those are kind of just like the main files that are going to hold a lot of your important stuff. And then you also have the processes. There's a whole bunch of different processes. Mostly these all act within the instance. But the important point to note is that the idea is these are things that are executed in order to run certain operations and make sure things just work how you want them to work. To give you a better idea of what that looks like, we're not going to go into this super detail. This kind of lays it all out for you. You've got the processes up here within the instance, the SJ, which is the memory that acts in the instance, and then all of that. This the whole thing is the instance up here that's acting and interacting with the database down here. And then you got the user running processes over here, because there are some processes that act outside of the instance. And you have the PGA, which is the memory that exists outside the instance as well. That stores all that information and helps you interact with your database using the instance. So some of the main differences you have between them. At the beginning, we have the 12C kind of really introduced this idea of multi-tenant architecture. We kind of talked about it a little bit before. I'm going to give you a little bit better idea of what that looks like in the next slide. We'll go over that in just a bit. Adaptive query optimization. You don't need to know too much about that. That's the main idea behind that is that they made it a little bit they made things run a little bit better. It's kind of has to deal with the idea of CDB and PDB, which is the container database and pluggable databases, which also there was updates to in 18C as well. It's and then also you have the idea of in-memory column storage. This basically stores memory in tables and petitions in order to make things a little bit faster. Yes, so then when you get up to 18C, by default, basically now everything is set to default to use multi-tenant architecture, which is really important because later on, also multi-tenant architecture is just the only thing you're really allowed to use within Oracle databases. So if you're in the earlier versions, you have to be very careful about migrating up to the newer versions with that. There's also just general updates to PDB and CDB. There was, in 19C, they added some better agility. A lot of this was, again, some more, it was a hard focus. A lot of the updates to the architecture was hard focus with the multi-tenant architecture, which they really leaned into starting back in 12C. And a lot of this was to try to make things faster, make it more capable. A lot of the big things they added was this idea of cloning databases, so you could move databases around, and you would have better options for testing things out with that. And then in 21C, you got the flashback buffer, which is great. It stores memories of changes you make in the database in the memory, which is really helpful if you accidentally make a mistake. You also have just other memory upgrades, and there's also new pools, which are some memory pools used to store different types of information. So a lot of memory updates in general to the architecture in 21C. So this is a little bit of a thing to help you out understand what the multi-tenant architecture is. We talked about it a little bit before in some other sections as well. So the PDPs are these pluggable databases, and then the CDP is the container database. The idea is basically the container database is a database of all databases. So you shove all your databases into different container databases, and you use that to have like shared configurations, or if you have, if you just want to have like one listener, you'd be able to interact with all different set of databases. It can be helpful in a lot of instances, but it can also create issues if you're migrating from a system where you did not have container or pluggable databases. So it's very important to be aware of that, especially as they push to make that the default, and then later on just the only supported way to do databases with Oracle databases. Okay, so some of the main security concerns. One of the big ones for the later versions is just the fact that they're expiring the support for it. 12C has already been expired, and 18C is going to no longer have support pretty soon. So those are some of the main concerns with those. There were some other minor concerns that I've noted down here, but with a lot of them, there's been some patches, or it's not a lot of things that's going to cause huge issues. The main thing to keep in mind as well is Oracle sometimes have issues with publicizing security concerns, and they can be a little bit slow to react to it. But in general, there hasn't been too many large security concerns with Oracle databases. 19C, one of the big things is the whole idea of only supporting multi-tenant architecture databases, which is very important if you were still holding on to those from one of your previous versions, something that was not a part of the multi-tenant architecture. You're going to be in a lot of trouble with 19C, so you need to make sure you migrate over to that. Besides that, there was also a few issues in 21C, which some of them are a little bit hard to explain, but the general idea is that there were some issues with the memory, but a lot of part of that was probably because they were doing a lot of updates to memory in the architecture for 21C. A lot of that has been patched now, and it's mostly good to go. There's not a lot of main issues with that, but that has been an issue with 21C in the past, so it's important to keep that in mind and be considerate, because there was a lot of new things that they introduced to the memory architecture in 21C. All right. Finally, licensing submissions. This is a lot of text, because basically what you have is Oracle has a whole bunch of different editions, but in each of their versions. So you have the different versions of Oracle, and each version has a bunch of different editions that you can get. The thing to keep in mind about Oracle as well is with their licensing, they won't stop you from doing anything if you have an Oracle. Like if you have an Oracle license, you can just go and make use of all the different stuff on there, even if your license doesn't actually permit you to do those things, but then they will come back around and talk to you about that. So on an enterprise level, it's very important to be aware of what you actually should have access to with your license, because they won't stop. There's nothing in the software to stop you from accessing it, even if you're not supposed to, but they will charge you for it. You're not going to get away scot-free for that. So you got to be very careful about that. Here's generally the different licenses that exist in 21C. There is a little bit of difference in the licensing for each edition, but it doesn't change a lot. Some of the main differences between the different editions is you got things like some of them were only on the cloud. Particularly if you go down here, you have some ones that were on the cloud, and then some are more based on local machines. That's one of the big things to keep in mind. And then also you have access to different services and different tools depending on your edition. But again, they won't restrict you what you use, even if you have a different licensing. So you have to be careful, make sure you're actually aware of what you have available. Here is a little bit of a better layout for 12C. Talks about which ones are on-premise. If it continues on, talks about which ones are on the cloud. Each one also has a bit of an abbreviation for it, and I included a little bit of a further explanation of what Oracle considers the main differences between the editions. Again, it's kind of on like a case-by-case basis what edition you want to use, and they have a lot of different editions. One of the big things is definitely the idea of being on-premise versus being on the cloud. And then also, again, if you decide that you want to make use of a certain service that isn't part of your edition, you still can, and you will have to pay for it later. But it's going to be a lot of discussion with Oracle and their licensing team, which they will call you up if this ever gets onto an enterprise level. You will have to speak with them pretty often. All right, so in 18C there wasn't any real changes to editions. The main thing is the Enterprise edition was renamed. It's the same thing. What's included in it is exactly the same. It was just changed from on Oracle Exa database machine, whatever, to engineered systems, which is important to keep in mind in case you're using one of the previous editions on an older version and you switch over, like, wait, where's my edition go? It's named this now. In 21C, they introduced this one new edition. Other than that, there wasn't anything else. It's a new on-premise edition. The important thing to keep in mind with this one, though, is this is, I believe, so this is their free edition, which was only introduced in 21C, so it is a free access, and they have a special license that exists just for this edition. So if you plan on using this, you should read up on that. And I think it's a little bit different than the actual software itself. So that one's a little bit different from the other editions. So yeah, this kind of notes some of the key changes in a more easy to read format. Again, you have different amounts of like containers and pluggable databases depending on your edition. 18C, there wasn't really any change to licensing. But in 19C, you had the introduction of RAC into some of the licensing stuff, or it was the removal of it, yeah. So RAC was introduced to the architecture a while back. It's another one of Oracle's stuff, and it was one of their services that they provide, and they just basically removed it from their from the standard edition licensing, so it no longer came with that licensing from 19C onwards. And then 21C, yeah, you got the free use terms and conditions when they introduced that new edition. That new license came with it. So main things to keep in mind about all these editions and licensing is you have to know what your security concerns are, because there's different security services offered depending on your edition. So you need to know what your concerns are, what edition's right for you. And you also need to be aware of like how you are supposed to comply with these licensing conditions. Because Oracle's responsible for different things, like if something goes wrong, some things Oracle are responsible for, and some things you are responsible for. So that's also ties into being aware of the different liability. So that's generally what you should really be concerned about. The editions and licensing aren't going to be meeting security concerns, but it does impact how you go about addressing security concerns, whether it be with you need to contact Oracle or you need a new service that isn't part of your edition. It's important to keep that all in mind. And that is all. Thank you for listening to our presentation.
Any questions? So what is SNMP? Simple Network Management Protocol. If you remember, that's part of networking that was brought up in Oracle as one of the processes. Kerberos. What is Kerberos? It's actually a platform for authentication.